You are experiencing the Knuckleheads of Liberty podcast.
It is September 25th, 2023, and welcome to the Knuckleheads of Liberty, where we are bringing you the people and the organizations fighting for liberty around the country and in your region, in the hopes that it will inspire you to do the same. And you can find a lot of our stuff too online if you want to go check out more of that as well. But today we have a special guest for you. It is Steven Greenhut. He is the Western Regional Director of the R Street Institute, which is a think tank promoting liberty. He's also on the Southern California editorial board. He's a longtime columnist newsman, I guess, and he is also the Pacific Research Institute City or Free City Center. You're the director for that, right, Stephen? I think I missed that on the notes there. But yeah, so we've got him to talk to, and we're going to find out all kinds of stuff about sort of what's been going on in both journalism and some of the problems with our public pension systems and our unions. So we'll dive into those issues. But before we get into that, let me introduce you to the rest of our panel. In our lower left-hand corner, we have Leon, the word Brathwaite, last word in Liberty. He is a retired engineer in the state of California. In my lower right-hand corner, we have Steven Greenhut, who I've just introduced, and my name's Jason McPhee, and I'll be your host today. So, Steven, before we get to anything specific, let me, James, our invisible hand, can you bring up the visual? I want to bring up Steven's website. So here is the R Street Institute. So it's free markets, free solutions. And Steven's been thinking about this stuff a long time. And so, Steven, tell us a little bit about what it is the R Street Institute does and what it is that you do there as well.
Yeah, R Street Institute, it's a free market think tank based in Washington, D.C., and I'm the Western director, so I handle issues in the Western states. So, they do a lot of work at kind of a pragmatic free market think tank. We're trying to affect actual policy change. So we do work in the technology policy, often opposing a lot of these proposals to regulate tech companies, harm reduction, and tobacco harm reduction. I mean, the state of California has banned flavored tobacco, and we've kind of we point out, we do a lot of research on how reduced harm products like vaping and things are it's better than, they're 95% safer than combustible cigarettes. So the goal of public policy should not be this kind of puritanism that tries to promote abstinence and things, but rather allows people to make better choices. So we do, occupational licensing reform, different commercial freedom type issues. So we're just trying to move the needle as much as we can. And in the Western states, obviously, housing work, I do a lot of housing work. Trying to promote housing, construction, additional construction of housing, increase the supply, deal with some of these regulations that make it hard to build housing and lead to our housing crisis here in the state. So we're trying to promote ideas that might actually take place. I mean, there's in the liberty movement, there are a lot of roles that can be played. One of the roles is to be more philosophical. And I do that, I think, to some degree as a writer, but there's also a role for trying to affect practical reform, and that's what R Street does. And then, as you mentioned, I'm on the Southern California News Group editorial board, so I write columns, and weekly column. I write unsigned editorials. I first came to California in the late 90s and 98. I worked for the Lima News, which was a newspaper in Lima, Ohio, big metropolis. And then I got a job at the Orange County Register, which was at the Freedom Communications. And they had a 30-some newspapers that the Hoyles family, they libertarians, great people, and they owned a chain of newspapers and that were dedicated to promoting liberty. Long tradition of liberty at the newspaper group. I mean, there's since been bankruptcies, and the new Southern California News Group is the 11 newspapers I write for are not no longer part of Freedom Communications. It's a different news group, but they've kept up the old traditions of libertarianism. And then at the Pacific Research Institute's Free Cities Center, they're a think tank now based in Pasadena area. But they're a long-standing think tank, and I do something called the Free Cities Center, which promotes market-based solutions to our urban problems. And I think what we see everywhere, especially in California, is there's always a attempt to promote a government solution, rarely any effort to look at how poorly those solutions have fared. And we're trying to come up with good ideas, not just bashing cities. That's not, I like cities. And we're not just writing articles about how miserable things have gotten in San Francisco. We're writing it, we're writing about things that might actually help make it a better city and make other cities better places, more livable, safer, cleaner. And it's meant to be productive. So in my old age, in my young age, I used to be more of a bomb thrower, but in my old age, I'm more of a let's seek out practical solutions. On my old days at the Orange County Register Editorial Board, I don't know if you've heard of Alan Bach. He passed away a few years ago, but he was always this optimist. And he always figured he was a great guy. Everyone was just this close to actually being a libertarian. And in my old age, I'm more along the lines of what Alan did, trying to promote ideas, trying to win people over with good ideas. And sometimes things do move in a good direction. And it's so you build the foundation for liberty, and then when the opportunity arises, the ideas are out there, and maybe someone will be listening. And I also want to, before we go further, just we should be fairly optimistic. I mean, if we look at the conditions of life now, they're much better than they had been. So there's progress. There's 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, but there's progress in some areas.
I noticed you did mention real quickly before that when the opportunity presents, well, certainly California has given us a lot of opportunities to try and improve things, right? I mean,
yes.
all the different things we're doing wrong.
Well, can I give an example? I mean, back when I first came to Southern California, and which was, we were in a small city in Ohio. My wife was kind of shocked by it. I accepted the job without discussing it with her. And she's like, "What do you mean we're moving to Southern California?" I'm like, aren't we going to discuss this? I'm like,
you sound like a central planner in your marriage.
I've been married 40 years, and she was all right with it. But it just seemed I've always wanted to come out here. But when we came out here, one of the first issues I wrote about were redevelopment agencies. And those were almost every city had one. It was a little local centrally planning agencies that used tax increment financing to so-called redevelop areas, but it just became a tax grab scheme that cities used and to subsidize big box stores and shopping malls and movie theaters and auto malls and hotels as a way to get bed taxes and sales taxes. Really distorted development, especially in Southern California. And also these agencies misused eminent domain. In fact, my first book was called Abuse of Power, and it was back in 2004, which was about abuses of eminent domain for private use, taking it not just to build a road, but taking a property. Cities would take a property from private owners and give it to a developer who would then build something that the city planners wanted, and that would bring in tax revenue. And eminent domain was abused wildly. So anyway, those agencies, they were really entrenched in the state, and they had the California Redevelopment Association representing them, and the League of California Cities, and redevelopment was a thing, and it wasn't going anywhere. And I remember there were quite a few people. I was a part of a movement that was pointing out the abuses we saw in the Supreme Court's Kelo decision. Ultimately, pointed out those a lot of those abuses on a nationwide level, and people like Chris Norby. He was a libertarian, but Republican assembly member, county supervisor in Orange County, was active in building the case against redevelopment agencies. Anyway, sure enough, the timing was right. In 2011, California faced what was it, like a $30 billion budget deficit, and Jerry Brown needed the money. And redevelopment agencies, because the state had to backfill the tax revenues that were taken from public schools and other traditional services, there was like quite a bit of money that was being diverted, and Brown needed the money, so he shut down redevelopment agencies. And the legislature passed the law. Brown signed it. It was he led the charge. The state Supreme Court upheld it, and you know what? Redevelopment agencies went away. And so I have friends of mine who say, yeah, but Jerry Brown didn't do it for the right reasons. And I'm like, I don't care what his reasons were. He did the right thing. So, if somebody wants to give me $1 million just to spite their spouse, I'll take it, right? I mean, if they want to do something that for the wrong reasons, I don't care. But in
when you mentioned, well, I was just going to say, when you mentioned Jerry Brown and the wrong reasons, I remember specifically when he pushed the latest push in minimum wage, and he literally just said he was doing it for the wrong reasons. He said, I know there's a lot of economists who say this stuff won't work, but we're going to do it anyway. So he said that in the press conference.
Well, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, Brown was an interesting character. I like him. He did some good things. He did some terrible things, but eliminating redevelopment was an amazing thing. It did advance liberty because although our state we never reformed our eminent domain laws like many other states did after the Kelo decision. By removing redevelopment, it removed the financial incentive to use eminent domain as frequently it was done before. And so that was a good thing. And then there have been efforts to bring it back, but they've failed. And the time has passed, and that was an advancement, liberty. And I like to bring that up as an example because it shows that even when it seems really hopeless, I remember meeting in these hotels with activists who would share their horrible stories. One of them, I was standing next to Tom McClintock, who, and we both stood up and gave Maxine Waters a standing ovation because on that one issue, she was really good because she talked about what LAUSD did in South Central Los Angeles in abusing eminent domain. So you build the foundation, and then maybe the time will be right, and you'll see it's like a dam break, right? It all builds up, and then so that's why we do this, not because.
So Stephen, you raised the Kelo decision, which I believe was decided in the late 1990s, which to me was a big anti-property rights decision, quite frankly. But I don't know how you feel about the decision itself. But the question I really have: does the R Institute, in terms of promoting liberty, does the R Institute, do they get involved in actual litigation?
No, we don't. R Street Institute. Kelo was a little later than that, but it was like 2005, I think. But anyway, it was a terrible decision. Yeah, it was a terrible decision. But Justice Sandra Day O'Connor's dissent was brilliant. And,
yes, I remember that. Yes.
And then the justices essentially encouraged states to pass laws reforming eminent domain, and most of them did. California, the law that we passed was ultimately written by supporters of redevelopment, which just goes to show. So we never did that. But the decision, it was a terrible decision, but it certainly spotlighted the abuses of eminent domain. It centered on a Pfizer proposal in New London, Connecticut. They were going to build some sort of headquarters,
Yes.
and would have eliminated the Fort Trumbull neighborhood, and they knocked down the neighborhood, and then nothing ever. I don't think anything's ever been built since. And I've covered those throughout California, mostly Southern California, some of these redevelopment projects, and my role at the Orange County Register editorial board back then, when I used to work full time for them, we really attack some of these proposals. There was one that would have in a Garden Grove that would have obliterated a middle-class neighborhood for the city to build a theme park on spec to compete with the Disneyland up the road. There were some really crazy things. There were some really crazy ideas. I mean, you don't want government when government serves as a central planner, it's amazing the stupidity and the destruction that you'll get. I mean, downtown Anaheim, and I'm sorry I've gone off on a tangent, so I'll stop quickly. But downtown Anaheim used to have one of the most beautiful downtown in Southern California, and the redevelopment agency in the 70s pretty much bulldozed it. So you don't want government officials to have that kind of power, and that's pretty much the lesson on eminent domain that I learned.
You see, but this is the problem, and this to me was the big problem with the Kelo decision. But the Kelo decision to me gave central planners even more power to pick winners and losers. And we know the government is only good at producing one thing, which is misery. That's all they do. They're very good at that. But which raises the question, though. How do we keep government in its assigned role? I mean, there are essential things that the government must do. I would agree to that. But how do we keep them to its constitutional duty without them always finding innovative ways to get beyond what is required of them in terms of limiting their scope in our lives?
I mean, that's the eternal question, isn't it? I mean, it's
well, at least let me hear your perspective on it. At least your perspective.
Somewhere. So yeah, I mean, that's what we're doing. That's what this is all about. Fighting the battles in wherever we can, and staying focused. Yeah. So on the eminent domain issue, you pushed for you make a push in the courts and there are all sorts of efforts, and there's no simple solution. It's this eternal vigilance, and that's true on every area. I mean, in policing, with trying to rein in some of these, qualified immunity. There's so many battles to fight. And part of the battle is to inform people of the value of liberty, because if people really value liberty, it's harder for government to take control over things it ought not to do. And I'm not an anarcho-capitalist. I believe there is a role for government. I mean, whenever I talk to it should be very limited. Whenever I talk to people who want to eliminate government entirely, not that that's ever going to happen. I mean, that's great for, I don't know, the after hours cocktail hour at the Libertarian Party convention. Maybe we can talk about it. It's fun to talk about, but they always come up with these convoluted ways to replace what government does with things that basically just replicate what government does. So I've just got the point, right? I mean, if somebody breaks into your house and commits a crime against you, at some point you have to use some level of force to restrain them. So yes, you could come up with all sorts of complex ways, and then it always ends up coming back to calling the police or right? I mean, you have to. So we could come up with all sorts of private alternatives, but ultimately you still have to be able to detain the person that's trying to kill you. So I don't worry as much about. I think there's a vast amount of reform that's needed on these fundamental services. I've written a ton about police abuse. I've covered a lot of cases in Southern California. And we'll talk, I think, a little later about pensions and how, law enforcement and firefighters, they've basically, and other government groups, I mean, they basically exist for, what one city manager said, we're a pension provider that provides a few public services on the side. So
vanishingly few.
Yeah, exactly. So it's crazy. So all these, even the things that government ought to be doing, or at least typically we accept are more likely to accept should be doing, those things need to be reformed. But then it's doing all these other things that it shouldn't be doing at all. So it's not an easy fix.
Well, let me ask this.
Hold on a second, Leon. Because we got to get to a few other things before we transition to the other stuff. So let me just get to the background real quick, and then we'll get you jumping back in on this. But James, can you pull up the map real quick? We've been talking about California, and so I just want to give our viewers a sense of where we're at. And I also wanted to ask Steven a little more about his background too, since we're talking about California. So this is Cato's Liberty map, and we try and show our viewers this just to give them a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about the authoritarian levels of government that's going on in different places. And so here we have California, and California, of course, it's no surprise to most of us, especially those of us who live here, is one of the least free states of all. In fact, I'm shocked that we're only number 48.
There's always New Jersey and Illinois to bail us out.
There you go. Yeah. But and of course, it's a state that is much more leans Democrat than Republicans. We get a few libertarians in local offices, but we can't really, we haven't been able to breach that state level on anything. But as you can see here, it's almost all blue, certainly Democrat senators. It's been that way for the last 20, 30 years, roughly. I think it's been at least 20 years since we've had a Republican governor in the state. So, so that's kind of, and of course, all the state offices too, it's almost all blue. So that's kind of what we're dealing with. But, you talked about moving here. So you haven't lived here your whole life. Were you liberty oriented when you moved here, or did living in California make you a liberty oriented person? I mean, what was it that rung your liberty bell on a lot of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in near Philadelphia, and it's been a long time. And I was a young liberal Democrat, and I moved to Washington, D.C. for college, and became caught up in the Reagan movement and became more of a conservative. And then moved when ultimately I ended up at the newspaper, the Lima News in Ohio, which is the Freedom Communications newspaper. And I was, very liberty oriented at that point. And then that really helped focus my thinking, working for a libertarian newspaper and having to write editorials and columns, and it really honed my thinking about liberty. And then when I came out to Southern California, I was I certainly had a pretty well developed libertarian viewpoint, so when I got here, I still wanted to come here. I mean, it's a beautiful state. I love it. I've since been to every one of the 58 counties, every city and town of any note. I've loved the state. It's great. And I think that one of the things about being in California, whenever you see a negative list of something, it's real easy. You just go to the bottom. And the rankings, there are all sorts of rankings, on anything, home affordability, freedom, whatever. You go to the bottom, and there's California. And then, our Democratic friends like to say, yeah, but we're the 5th largest economy in the world. And they obviously never learned the word despite. It's such, right, despite everything.
Yeah, they're working on eroding that.
Yeah, it's still a great state despite all their efforts to make it less so. And I've been here. I've been here long enough now to have watched. When I got here, we still had a Republican governor. Republicans could still occasionally win statewide office. And that's changed quite a bit. And I was looking at the statewide, the statewide vote count from the last election, and it's pretty much on all statewide offices. It's like 60-40 Democrats. And now we're at the point where the Republicans, not that Republicans, you guys are libertarians, but Republicans aren't exactly great shakes, but they're not in favor of liberty in their own areas, right? They're in favor of it, except when they're not. And but still, it's nice to have a two-party state. And if you got the Republican name, the only non-Democrat who's come close was I think Steve Poizner ran for insurance commissioner again, and he came very close as a no party preference. Not that he was a great insurance commissioner in the past, but anyway, it's just the way it is. So you mentioned some libertarians at the local level. I'm not sure of many that even win local seats. I know Jeff Hewitt was the Riverside County supervisor, and that was a pretty high level elected position for a libertarian. And when he was mayor of Calamasa, he helped institute a pretty significant firefighting reform. And then it was Republicans who couldn't stand that, and they authored bills to make sure it couldn't happen anywhere else statewide. Republicans, because of their alliance with the public safety unions. So we can't really rely on Republicans, can we?
Yeah. Well, and as far as those offices go, that's exactly like what I'm talking about. These things like city council member, mayor, and some of these smaller areas and stuff. Because we've interviewed at least one on our show from Southern California area, and of course across the country, we've been interviewing a lot of people from different local offices. But yeah, that's all we're seeing, obviously, and
they're not winning, are they? I mean, not many.
Well, occasionally there are. There's a few. In fact, we not so much in California. There's about 5 or 6, but you can actually go to the Libertarian Party's website, and they have a link for elected officials, and so you can actually find all the people who declare themselves as libertarians and who have actually won local offices and stuff. And so that's actually as a little secret. That's how I get some of our guests on the show.
And there was a woman who was a libertarian who was a mayor of, I forgot what city it was here in California.
We interviewed her. I'd have to look it up again real quick because it's been a while. It's been about a year since we interviewed her. Yes. But it's so there's a few. I felt like it was almost like a unicorn because they had a city council of 5 people, and she had convinced a couple others to switch over to Libertarian, and then they summarily got rejected in the next election. She told me.
That's usually what happens. I remember. Hold
on, just a second. Let me break in for time. If you're watching us on public access, we've got to go, but you can catch the rest of this conversation on our other websites, Rumble, the Spotify, YouTube, and Facebook. Just look up knuckleheadsofliberty.com, and you can find the rest of this conversation and a lot of others too. So join us there. Okay, back to the show. Go ahead, Steven.
When I used to go to libertarian events, remember they'd bring out the elected officials, and it was always something like, dog catcher, and it was water board. I mean, I'm not saying these don't have their role, but as an elected movement, there hasn't been a lot of headway. Although I do think with city council elections being technically nonpartisan, we know that's just a technicality. The parties always get involved in them, but still, it does offer an opportunity. But it takes hard work, and I do feel like a lot of people from any third party, there's a certain element that likes to put their name on the ballot, but it's harder to go from there to actually knocking on every door. I remember one city council member who won years ago in Southern California. He knocked on every door in our city of 50-some thousand people, and that's hard work. I wouldn't want to do it, but he won. So it's retail politics is still important.
Well, a lot of these
Yeah.
people too who are getting elected, they're in very small areas. So, but I did want to start a push us on toward one of the other topics too,
Sure.
because we definitely want to hit our discussions on unions and stuff. But because we have you on the show and you've been a journalist, I didn't want to let it go without asking you. We've been seeing this erosion of, I guess, liberty values in journalism, and it's refreshing to hear you talk about you're part of a news group that really pushes that. But what's your perspective on this as a journalist, seeing all of these people in journalism sort of come, not standing up for people like Julian Assange and other things like that? It just seems like we've really kind of are turning upside down as a society.
Yeah, my views on where journalism have gone are a little complex. I don't think things have gotten worse. I mean, when I got into, I'm old enough now. I'm 63, so I remember the previous journalism era, and I kind of laugh now. I'll read, especially conservatives will say this a lot when social media about the good old days when journalists just stuck to the facts. And then which is it's so hilariously idiotic. And then there's this idea that these are like the worst of times in journalism, which is, I'm like, wow, that's not the world I grew up in. When I was younger, I wanted to get into journalism. This was, it was before the internet. It was talk radio was just in its infancy. There wasn't even much of this, this kind of cable news or access, TV type access. You pretty much had the newspaper. I remember I lived in Des Moines, Iowa at the time, and we had the Gannett newspaper that got delivered to the door in the morning. That was the only publication. It was a very liberal newspaper, and you didn't have alternatives if you wanted to get published. Aside from, there were some magazines out there and things, but locally, that was it. It was the Des Moines Register, and I wanted to write for them. And you had to go through their gatekeepers, and it was very hard to get your view out unless you want to, mimeograph a newsletter and hand it out to your neighbors. There weren't a lot of choices. So, and then the TV news. I mean, you had the three talking heads on the three networks who were all, pretty. They certainly had a better pretense of objectivity than you see now, but they certainly had a point of view and a lot of things.
And it's funny too, because they almost seemed interchangeable. I mean, you could change the channel,
right,
and it was almost the same stuff no matter what.
Right, it was the same stories, right? So the same basic stories. And then I remember I used to get so mad because there were stories that I thought ought to have been covered and weren't getting covered. So then we had this whole explosion with the internet, talk radio, and then all of a sudden, all sorts of views could get aired. And now I was so naive. I thought that with the internet explosion, that people would seek out good information and would become much more informed voters. And I thought it was a great thing, and I'm not saying it isn't in many ways, but instead, the lowest common denominator seems to rule. Now we see everyone's in their news silos, and sure, the mainstream media is maybe more biased than it had been, in that it doesn't have to even pretend to be objective. Not that there's ever been you can't have anything that's objective, but there was no pretense of neutrality now. But you don't have to rely on them. You could read anything you want, and that's the problem. Everyone reads whatever they want. So now, I'll quote, let's say, I remember quoting something, a pretty well-researched story by the New York Times. And of course, the New York Times has its bias, obviously, but it's still a really well-researched story done to high-level journalism standards. And then people would write into me and say, oh, that's the New York Times. And then they'd send me a video that their Aunt Ethel sent them from some unnamed kook somewhere, and recording it from their basement as a rebuttal. And that's kind of where we've gotten, right? Where now, before, everyone was kind of stuck focusing on these narrow choices. And now we could listen, confirmation bias. You could watch, listen, read anything you want. And a lot of I some of my conservative friends, they're always complaining about the mainstream media. I'm like, well, have you looked at the conservative media lately? They don't even quote, they don't even quote any other viewpoint. So yeah, it's a mess. But I don't think it's like all of a sudden journalists have become different. I think the whole media environment has changed, and journalists had always been, they'd always been a fairly liberal crowd. That's not a big surprise. I worked in newsrooms, editorial pages in newspapers, where I was one of the very few non-liberals. But there were standards, though. I don't know
It does feel
but Stephen, I'm trying to understand your take on all of this here. Okay, now it is clear, as far as I can tell, that the mainstream media, the so-called mainstream media, have gotten in bed with the government, as far as I can tell. Okay, because every time I turn on the TV and I'm looking at any one of the mainstream news, I could also look at the talking points coming out of the White House, and it's almost one and the same. On the other hand, we have social media, where you say that we can listen to or read whatever we want. That is mostly true. But there's a great amount of censorship going on in social media, even though those are private organizations. But these social media giants are also in bed with the government, the Democratic-led government. So I don't know how you can make the argument that things have not changed and changed radically in terms of our consumption of news. And I don't know how we make the argument that journalism itself has not transformed itself into almost an arm of the government. I mean, I'm not talking about every single journalist in America, but I think to a large extent, with big media, big tech, they have almost, not quite, but almost become an arm of the government. And I find that frightening, but you are making the case that not very much have changed. I would like you to just expand on that a little bit, because I am seeing something totally different.
Well, and Leon, before you go real quick on Stephen, I wanted to just add on one little thing, because you mentioned that the journalists are mostly liberal, and absolutely there's going to be this liberal bias, but it seems to be almost like recently it's changed. The definition of liberal has changed almost. That's kind of what I'm seeing. So I mean, it's even though they're on the left, what the left has changed.
Well, and so is what is a conservative now?
That's true.
Yeah, now this populist right thing, which doesn't seem a lot like the certainly the post-Reagan conservatism of free markets, and we've become almost like conservatives have become almost like European style conservatives who no longer are trying to conserve the classical liberal experiment of the founders. But look, the journalism, I guess my point is, journalism has always been kind of liberal. It's just wide open now, right? So I'm not dismissing the points you make. I mean, I saw how some of the tech companies, the platforms, they obviously have their own policies, and I think they have a right to have their own policies. They're private organizations. But yeah, they put pressure on, the government's pressured them. But you don't think governments pressured the Washington Post in the past to squelch stories? And you don't think a lot of what has always passed for journalism is really simpatico with what government has won? I've covered it at the local level, and I remember I used to give some of my fellow reporters a hard time. I'm like, dude, that is not a scoop. That is called a press release. It's not a scoop. The city manager fed you that. And I mean, what do you think? And now, maybe reinforcing your point is, the number of journalists out there doing original reporting has certainly at the local and regional newspaper level has fallen dramatically.
Yes.
And I remember we had the Orange County Register in its heyday. There were 10 or 11 of us just on the editorial page. And now, you don't see those kind of numbers on editorial pages, and it's and the newsrooms have been obliterated. The number of the newspaper I one newspaper I worked at in the past, when I worked there, they had a big new building and a small town. There must have been 100 people working there, and now I think they're in a small office somewhere with a handful of people. And same thing with the big journalism enterprises, went from hundreds of reporters to dozens of reporters. So if you don't have reporters covering city council meetings and board of supervisor meetings, you don't know what's you don't know what's going on, and people don't know what's going on. So yes, the journalism, it's not just bias, it's just a lack of resources and a lack of coverage. And there's so many agencies and so many government entities to cover, and we have less of that coverage. And in its place, we're seeing a lot of it's just pure opinion journalism, and a lot of and it's not, the public, the circulation numbers on the mainstream newspapers, I don't even know how to measure them anymore. We used to measure just printed newspapers that were delivered, and now they try to measure eyeballs. But the circulation levels have just fallen; they've just cratered. Yes. So those people who are railing against the mainstream media, they're certainly forgetting the fact that the mainstream media is just a shadow of what it once was. And in its place are all these different, I think, politically motivated publications that have really strong points of view, many of them on the right and a lot of them on the left. And I read a lot of those things, and I don't even see what I think would I've had a lot of reporters work for me over the years, and I read these stories. I'm like, these aren't news stories. There's no effort to talk to the other side or hash things out. They're just basically glorified opinion pieces. And you see now, you'll see articles where publications will report on somebody's tweet. So it's gotten but on the other hand, it used to be hard to get all the underlying documents. And now you can watch the city council meetings after the fact, or live streaming. You can watch them on video. You get all the reports, right? All the staff reports. You read the court cases of the stories. There's so much really valuable information that you couldn't get easily before. I mean, before you'd have to run to the courthouse or do a public records request for some of these things. And now it's all at our hands. And yet with all this availability, it's like the meme goes, we spend all our time posting videos of cats. And I love cats, by the way, and I spend more time than I should watching cat videos, but all the same, there are,
sponsored by Friskies.
Let me just ask something here. Let me ask a question here, okay, that maybe could highlight the point I am trying to make. Okay, it is true, the free press is constitutionally protected, and they should be, and nobody's arguing that point. The problem is that free press being constitutionally protected means that we should be looking at the creation of a marketplace of ideas where things are competing. So yes, somebody might want to post something about a cat, but somebody might want to post something else about a dog. Somebody might want to post something about libertarian politics. Somebody want to post something about democratic politics, and on and on. The whole idea is that the marketplace of ideas we're supposed to be out there, and all these ideas are competing, and the best ideas will survive. And that's how theoretically it should be. The problem is, though, when there are major components functioning within that whole marketplace of ideas, getting in bed with the government, which is a potential problem, like big tech taking some of its orders from the government. I mean, the FBI was heavily involved with Twitter.
Leon, let me jump in real quick with one thought, because it was something that dovetails right to what you're saying. But specifically, like you were talking so much about, Stephen, how easy it, or how I guess, how hard it used to be to get the actual information and the real legwork. But when we look at something like the Hunter Biden laptop story, I mean, literally, it was just kind of teed up there. The New York Post had it out there,
Very good example.
and it was like, what? And it was like nobody really wanted to even inquire about it. I mean, it was
And
sort
they
of like,
still don't.
and the government was just sort of telling everybody, "Oh, don't worry, that's Russian propaganda," and the media and almost as a whole just said, "Oh, okay, it's Russian propaganda."
Right, the
No, but I
mainstream
want to add
media-
something to that point. That point you're making, Jason, that's a very good point to raise, but I want to add something to that. You know, there's good data to suggest that if the Hunter Biden laptop was allowed to be in that marketplace of ideas, it might have changed. It might have, I cannot say with certainty, it might have changed the outcome of the elections. So the suppression of that laptop actually changed the direction of this country.
Well,
I see that as a real problem.
That's true about it. I mean, I remember in the days of the the good old days when there were during past elections when there was this huge effort to suppress stories and we were totally dependent on these three networks. And I remember when Dan Quayle, misspelled potato. I mean, that was a big deal at the time. Now we all shrug when, you've got a former president, maybe the next president, who makes weird suggestions about executing a Joint Chief of Staff member. And he actually, tried to steal an election right before our eyes. And nothing he says that's just life. I mean, it's human beings work in media institutions. Governments have too much power and they pressure media institutions. And then you've got all these ideologues out there on the left and right who are just pushing talking points. Yeah, of course, all sorts of different stories could have changed the outcome of any election. I mean, that's what, that's the way life works. I'm not defending. I don't think the government should be pressuring private media organizations, but it's nothing new. I mean, remember the Pentagon Papers, for heaven's sake. This is not anything new. You don't think the Nixon White House tried to put the cap on the Watergate story? I mean, this is always you don't think the Trump administration tried to shut things down? It's what we need is a vibrant media environment, and what we have now is I don't even know how to explain it, but I think there's too much focus on just the mainstream media. There's so much of everything out there. A lot of what I see I don't think is good, but there's I don't know, there's no magical fix, but the idea that we have fewer choices and the media's more control than it ever has been seems hard for me to take, because I remember the limited options that we had. And then you talk about, and some of this is just ideological, right? I mean, Fox News strikes me as, a lot of it seems like state-run TV, but it's not being directed by anyone. It's just, that's the viewpoint of the people who run the network. And MSNBC seems the same way, right? So
well, it's just so that with all this Twitter files stuff that we did start hearing about, it did seem like, government, well, of course, like you're saying, government was probably strong arming the big networks back at the time.
And we're reading about it now, right? I mean, we're, it's remember in the past, and I'm not trying to defend anything that you're pointing out or anything that's happening now, but in the past, things really would just get suppressed, and there were very few other ways to hear about them.
Yeah.
I mean, when you had three networks and no talk radio, no internet, three networks and the daily newspaper, if your editor at the very liberal daily newspaper, most likely in the town that you lived in, chose not to put that on the front page or anywhere in the paper, where would you hear about it?
Yeah.
You wouldn't.
Okay.
The problem is, it's a consumer-driven thing, and what happens when, I don't know, like in anything, we all know the restaurant down the street that offers really delicious, healthy, good quality food, And you got people like me who prefer, the fried chicken joint and the greasy burger joint. I mean, you can't force people to go eat a healthy meal. You can't force them to want to go and read the city council minutes. I mean, I've watched, CalPERS hearings. Talk about, I guess I need a life, but I'll watch those things, and it's amazing the information that you see if you're willing to. But most people are not. It's the libertarian thing, rational ignorance, right? How much time are you going to spend learning about CalPERS when it has very little influence on your life, even though broadly speaking, it has a lot of influence on the state budget and those sorts of things.
Which is a great reason to keep government small so that we don't have to spend much of our time worrying about what they're doing.
It should be so small we shouldn't care who the president is, but that train's left the station.
Yeah, but when you were talking about CalPERS, that's a great segue, and unfortunately, we're going to have to probably try and squeeze it a little because we've gone so far over on other stuff. But you wrote a book called Plunder, and it was James. Can you pull up the visual? And it's how public employee unions are raiding the treasuries, controlling our lives, and bankrupting the nation. And certainly, we've seen the power of these unions within California, especially the public employees unions. It's living in Sacramento, you can't not know somebody who doesn't have a family member or who isn't themselves working for government and somehow tied into all this. So, certainly unions are having a huge impact on the state and the country, but mostly, governance, because of all of these, at the state level, all of these union members who are, they have pensions. Most of the jobs are getting, more and more stuff is getting shifted toward union work within government. And so it's creating a big problem with the public pensions. This is a 2019 thing where the PPIC was essentially showing the unfunded liabilities are starting to get out of control with the pensions here in California. And this here is an article from the Center Square that's talking about California. We have a $1.5 trillion public pension debt load, which I'm not 100% sure what that means, but essentially it's a few years later on that whole PPIC report, and the problem's gotten bigger. And is there any end in sight? It almost seems like we're headed toward a Titanic collapse here in California that may be being steered by the pensions. What are your thoughts on some of this, Steven? Especially since you wrote a book on this. It's a little more than a decade ago, I think now. But it's are we closer to collapse, I guess, than we were back when you wrote this?
It hasn't gotten better, that's for sure.
Well, it's totally tied to the pension debt, and what's going to happen is tied to stock market returns, and where basically the pension funds make a guess on future returns, paying for the current benefits and the benefits for future retirees. So I think CalPERS, the largest pension fund in the country, is funded at, I think, in the 70-something%, which means it has 70% of the money available to make good on all the promises that it's made. I think there have been efforts in the whole pension reform issue back in 2011, 2012. It was a big thing back when the state had a budget crisis and a number of events. There was a confluence of events and concerns about the pension systems. And then what we saw where there were efforts at reform. Jerry Brown signed PEPRA, the Public Employees Pension Reform Act, which modestly trimmed pensions. And different cities like San Diego passed a pension reform. And then the state agency essentially killed it. The California rule, which is basically, it's not even a rule, it's just called the California rule. It's a series of court interpretations, says that you cannot reduce pensions or any benefits for public employees going forward unless you give them something of equal value. So that killed the reform in San Jose. The legislature is not going to touch it because they're owned essentially by the public employee unions. I mean, the public employee unions have exorbitant power there. So nothing's going to happen. Pensions are a senior obligation of the state. That means if everything collapses, they're the first thing to get paid. So we'll have public employees living up in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, enjoying themselves, even if the state collapses. We have something called crowd out. Cities are paying so much in pensions that it's crowding out all these other public services. If you really want to blow your mind, go to Transparent California and look at what some of these public employees earn and receive in pensions, and you'll see police sergeants $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 a year. There's the 3% at 50 retirement benefit, so they retire with 90% of their final year's pay. It's just amazing the amount of greed and the unions just have been able to rig all the rules in their favor so that the kind of pay, when you hear policymakers complain that we can't hire enough police or whatever it is, take a look at what they're paying the current ones and the retirees. There's this shadow workforce of retirees. So it's a mess. It's driven by union power. Public employees get outrageous, especially in the public safety segment. Your typical firefighter in California total compensation package is what, $225, something north of there. You have cities where they're making $300,000 a year. You have captains making twice that in some cases. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, we're not saying you don't pay someone a fair wage, but it's crazy. And no wonder we don't have any money. And the system, it's not going to get fixed. No one is going to touch that. No. And Republicans, as I pointed out earlier, when it comes to the law enforcement and firefighting unions, they're closely allied with them. And they're the ones that get the largest pay and pension packages. So nothing will happen and nothing's going to, as long as they can kick the can down the road, nothing's going to happen. Never underestimate the ability of California legislators to kick the can down the road and tweak it just enough that things don't collapse. So don't sit around waiting for a collapse. Not that would be good.
And there's a real consequence to some of this too, because as you're saying, this eats into the money that can be used for other services.
Mm-hmm.
So like when they're paying all these people to essentially do nothing in retirement for many, many years, then there was a funny meme I remember seeing where it shows like about 6 or about 10 construction people standing around. There's one guy in the hole and he's digging really hard, and the other guys are all standing around drinking coffee, looking down at him. And then it says, "Oh, due to budget cuts, we're going to have to fire Joe," and the guy's name in the hole is Joe because and it's like he's the only one doing that.
Yeah, it is crowding out things. I mean, it's crowding out all the many services that people think they're getting from government, and because you're paying so much, and then they're retiring at age 50. I had this debate with this PolitiFact actually quoted me on one of these stories where one of these police union chiefs said that, oh well, the reason we get such big pensions is because we die 2 to 3 years after we retire. And then I went through the CalPERS data and the Oregon OSERS data from Oregon, and actually the longest living public employee are police and firefighters. Firefighters first, then police. They live into their mid-80s. That's why we have a pension problem. I wish everyone a long, healthy, happy, and prosperous life, but let's not make things up, right? And then PolitiFact actually did a big false on that guy's statement after I provided him with all the data. So they'll say all sorts of things to justify these crazy pensions. I mean, do you really think people ought to be earning $200,000 a year at age 50, and then they're going to live to be 85? And so that money comes from somewhere. It comes from the pension fund, but their pension funds are underfunded. it's a system designed by the people who benefit from the system, and that's the whole problem with public sector unions. And my book was only about public sector unions, not private unions, which are they have their own problems, but it's a totally different animal.
Yes.
In the private sector, you can't kill the host. Well, you can. I grew up in Pennsylvania and I saw them do that. But if you do kill the host, you're in a world of hurt. Here,
there's at least a little moral hazard.
A little more. The unions here elect the people that they then negotiate with.
Exactly. That is a major. That's a major point you're making there, and that's a major corruption that is ongoing. So
I remember. Yeah, that's the problem, right? I remember seeing there was a report in Orange County after there was a deal to boost the salary for public employees. The head of the union and the head of negotiations for representing taxpayers supposedly were seen at a Santa Ana restaurant splitting a bottle of champagne. I thought, to me, that's the picture of what's going on here.
Exactly. Nobody. Now, we the taxpayers. Now, full disclosure, I'm a retired public employee. Okay.
I gathered that when you said you worked for the state.
Yes.
I wasn't going to mention it. I wasn't going to tease you about it, but you mentioned it. So in Sacramento, you can't even have a libertarian show without somebody who's
yes. Imagine that.
Everything's distorted. Everything's distorted in California. Even libertarians.
Even libertarians get sucked into this damn nonsense. But just in my full disclosure, I was forced to pay union dues. Okay, forced. I really mean that. Force of law until 2018, I think, or something like that. Something like that. But the whole point is though. I think here you just pointed to the major problem that we see with public employees and public employee unions, I should say. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt made this very point about the dangers of public employee unions because it can change the direction of the sovereign being the government in his speech. The thing is that in these negotiations, when the unions help elect the politicians and then they end up negotiating with these same people, no one is really representing the taxpayer who is paying the bill. Nobody's representing them. And this is a real problem. This is a major corruption that is ongoing. And this speaks directly to the problems that you are pointing out in your book, Plunder. I've never read the book, but based upon what you're saying here, I can see this very problem being highlighted.
Well, it's funny too. They use. Oh, sorry. Oh, I was just gonna say, and they wind up getting the money from the essentially the government through the employees who they argue for a better pay for, and then they essentially take those fees out and use that to re-lobby against the same people that they're negotiating with. So just and help fund their campaigns and stuff. So and not just fund their campaigns, but it sounds like they are really critical in going after people they don't like too. It's not necessarily being for someone; it's being not being on their hate list, I guess. Is
true.
It's a big issue.
I mentioned earlier the effort to the legislature passed a law to stop cities from doing what Calamasa did, which was to and also Placentia. They created their own fire departments to get out from under the CalPERS pension requirements. And then the legislature passed a law so that no other city can do that. So they're not just boosting their own benefits and pay; they're shutting down alternatives. And a union-controlled PERB, the Public Employment Relations Board, a state agency that's very union-friendly, shut down the San Diego initiative that would have reformed pensions by claiming that the right to meet and confer supersedes the right of voters to have a say. So the whole system is rigged from top to bottom. My argument a couple of years ago was we lost. We tried for 10 years to reform pensions. through voter initiatives, through legislative action, through the courts, and we've lost up and down. So we tried. There's, we lost. So now they're, what can you do? So.
Yeah. Would you, do you see there being a potential, collapse? Because I know in the past we talked about, we've heard about some of these cities going through bankruptcy, because of their all of the debt obligations they had, and some of those, big part of those being pensions and pay. And I mean, do you think we're headed that way with the whole state, or maybe some cities, or?
No, the cities could. I mean, I covered the Stockton bankruptcy, which was driven in part by pensions and their medical care, where you work for the city for 2 months and you have lifetime medical care, and the redevelopment agencies. But yeah, municipalities could indeed, go bankrupt at some point, but nothing's about to collapse or anything. I was on a. It was on Fox News show, and I remember this was a number of years ago, back when California had its financial problems, and the host was pushing me to tell him when California is going to go bankrupt. I'm like, it's not going to go bankrupt. States can't go bankrupt, and it's not going to go bankrupt. And he didn't seem to like that, but they're not, and most cities are not going to go bankrupt. They're just going to slowly erode services. And that's what's going to happen, because it's not beneficial for city officials to have a bankruptcy, but it's also they can't. So we're just going to see kind of a slow erosion for now, for the foreseeable future. So
so those erosions will be
I'm not a big believer in waiting.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think we're having some slow.
Yes, I'm not a big believer in waiting for things to collapse and all of a sudden people see the light. When does that happen? I mean, look at Detroit, right? I mean, people would say, well, things will get so bad that people will finally see the light. And, has that happened in Detroit?
No, it didn't.
It did not happen. So anyway, it's just, but we just keep pointing out the problem. At some point, going back to what I said when we started this, at some point, we put forward positive solutions. And at some point, when the time's right, maybe someone will listen, because they have no choice to. I have no choice, meaning that if they don't, things will be worse than if they do what we say.
Yeah, essentially getting to like 1 hour police response times and other things like that. I mean, those are all consequences of spending so much money in some places that you don't have it for the actual services people are demanding at the moment. But well, I guess we're getting we've gone over the hour, and so we had wanted to talk about ESG as well, but I'm going to kick that, since I don't want to waste Steven's time anymore. Yeah, but I did want to get to the Knucklehead Noise Patrol. This will be real quick, but so James, maybe you could bring up the visual. This just kind of underscores kind of the craziness of unions. And this is a union president of the CTU, the Chicago Teachers Union, and she had called essentially private schools fascist and racist, and was completely trying to kill school choice reforms that were headed that way. And it came out, and this was back in August of 2022. She was telling people that, hey, look, I'm one of you. I send my kids to to these public schools and all that. And then we found out that no, she's actually sending her son to a private school. But can you roll the video real quick, James? It's a pretty short video of her talking about.
And we're mothers. And we send our children to the Chicago public schools. And remember, we live next door to you. So we work. We live next door to you. We're raising our families in the same neighborhoods. Think about who we are.
And And who they are is not who they say they are, because it turned out that there was a scandal. Her son is, in fact, going to a public or a private school, and it's because they couldn't offer the services she wanted in the public school. Her son couldn't play soccer.
Go figure.
She said her son could go to the private school so he could live out his dreams. That's what she said.
Yeah. Well, no one else has dreams either.
Yes,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
I don't begrudge her for giving her son the best opportunity possible. What I do begrudge and what I'm disgusted at is her hypocrisy in doing so. I am a parent myself, and I would do the best I could for my children and my grandson. But don't be a damn hypocrite jumping up and down about, public school and school choices racist and school choices this. What about all of the black and brown kids in Chicago who can't live out their dreams too because they are stuck? They are stuck in this national disgrace of what we call public education. What about those people? They don't have dreams too, right? I guess not.
No soccer for them.
No soccer for them, of course not. Jeez.
So, well, I think that reaches us to about the end of the show. And Steven, did you have any final thoughts you want to leave the audience with? About journalism, what you're doing, any new projects, anything?
I think Leon's final thought is a good ending point. We respect her as a parent for making the right decision, but why can't other parents have that same decision? It's the hypocrisy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that the overall thing is when we invoke government, we wind up really limiting ourselves, all of us, on our decisions. And that's the whole point, right? I mean, is that, you put this public school system in and make it unionized, and suddenly you are limiting everybody's choices. It's sort of a one size fits all. But that said, we've reached the end of the show, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank you, Steven, for being our guest today. Hopefully our audience has gotten a lot out of that, and thank our audience as well for joining us for this conversation. I'd encourage you to go online and check us out on Rumble, YouTube, Spotify, and Facebook. Just look for knuckleheadsofliberty.com, where you can find us talking to people like Steven and others who are fighting for liberty across the country and in your region. And before the next show, think about what you can do in your region to make a difference too. So thanks so much for joining us again. And until next time, stay tuned and stay free.
Yes, indeed. Steven, thank you.
Thank you.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, always and forever.
Thank you for listening to the Knuckleheads of Liberty podcast. Find us on Facebook, Rumble, YouTube, your favorite podcast network, and at knuckleheadsofliberty.com.